Chapter 46 of Oldtown Folks. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Oldtown Folks by Harriet Beecher Stowe, Chapter 46, Wedding After-Talks at Oldtown. Wedding joys are commonly supposed to pertain especially to the two principal personages, and to be of a kind with which the world doth not intermeddle. But a wedding in such a quiet and monotonous state of existence as that of Oldtown is like a glorious sunset, which leaves a long afterglow, in which trees and rocks, farmhouses, and all the dull commonplace landscape of real life have for a while a roseate hue of brightness. And then the long after-talks, the deliberate turnings and revampings, and the re-enjoying bit by bit of every incident. Sam Lawson was a man who knew how to make the most of this, and for a week or two he reigned triumphant in Oldtown on the strength of it. Others could relate the bare, simple facts, but Sam Lawson could give the wedding, with variations, with marginal references and explanatory notes and enlightening comments that ran deep into the history of everybody present, so that even those who had been at the wedding did not know half what they had seen until Sam told them. It was now the second evening after that auspicious event. Aunt Lois and my mother had been pressed to prolong their stay over one night after the wedding to share the hospitalities of the Kittery mansion, and had been taken round in the Kittery carriage to see the wonders of Boston town. But prompt on their return, Sam came in to assist them in dishing up information by the evening fireside. "Well, Miss Badger," said he, "'twas generally agreed on all hands there hadn't been no wedding like it seen in Boston since the time them court folks and nobility used to be there. Old Luke there, that rings the chimes, he told me he hadn't seen no such couple go up the broad aisle of that church. 'Luke,' says he to me, 'I tell you the grandeur of Boston is here to-day, and you'd better believe every one on 'em had on their Sunday best. There was the Boylstons, and the Bowdens, and the Braddles, and the Winthrops, and the Bradfords, and the Penhallows up from Portsmouth, and the Quinceys, and the Sewells. Well, I tell you, there was real grit there. Folks that come in their grand carriages, I tell you. There was such a pawing and a stamping of horses and carriages around the church as if all the army of the Assyrians was there.' 'Well, now, I'm glad I didn't go,' said my grandmother. 'I'm too old to go into any such grandeur.' 'Well, I don't see why folks has so much objections to these here Episcopal weddings, neither,' said Sam. 'I tell you, it's a kind of pretty sight now. You see, I was up in the organ loft, where I could look down on the heads of all the people. Massy to us! The bonnets and the feathers and the Injy shawls and the purple and fine linen was all out on the occasion, and when our Harry come in with Tiny on his arm, there was a general kind of buzz, and folks riz up all over the house to look at 'em. Her dress was your real Injy satin, thick and yaller, kind of like cream, and she had on the Piermont pearls and diamonds." "How did you know what she had on?" said Aunt Lois. "Oh, I has ways of finding out," said Sam. "You know, old General Pierpont, his great-great-grandfather, was a general in the British Army in Injy, and he ratcheted around among them nabobs out there, and got no end of gold and precious stones, and these here pearls and diamonds that she wore on her neck and in her ears has come down in the Devonport family. Miss Delilah, Miss Deborah Kittery's maid, she told me all the particulars about it, and she says there ain't no family so rich in silver and jewels and such as Ellery Davenport's is, and has been for generations back. His house is just chock full of all sorts of graven images and queer things from China and Japan, 'cause, you see, his ancestors, they traded to Injy, and they seem to have got the abundance of the Gentiles flowing to 'em. I noticed those pearls on her neck, said Aunt Lois. I never saw such pearls. Well, said Sam, Miss Delilah, she says she's tried 'em 'longside of a good-sized pea, and they're full as big. And the earrings, them pear-shaped pearls, with diamond nubs atop on 'em. Then there was a great pearl cross, and the biggest kind of a diamond right in the middle on it. Well, Miss Delilah, she told me a story about them 'ar pearls, said Sam. For my part, if it had been a daughter of mine, I'd ruther she'd a worn something on her neck that was spick and span new. I tell you, these yer old family jewels, I think sometimes they gets kind of struck through and through with moth and rust, so to speak. I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Sam, said Aunt Lois literally, since we know gold can't rust, and pearls and diamonds don't hurt with any amount of keeping. Well, you see, they do say that there old General Pierpont was a pretty hard customer. He got them 'ar pearls and diamonds away from an Injun princess. I suppose she thought she'd as much a right to 'em as he had, and they say it was about all she had was her jewels, and so, naturally enough, she cursed him for taking on 'em. Well, don't know's the Lord minds the curses of these poor old heathen critters, but it's been a fact, Miss Delilah says, that them jewels hain't never brought good luck. General Pierpont, he gin 'em to his first wife, and she didn't live but 2 months arter she was married. He gin 'em to his second wife, and she took to drink and lead him such a life that he wouldn't have cared if she had died too. And then they come down to Ellery Davenport's first wife, and she went raving crazy the first year after she was married. Now, all that there does look a little like a curse, don't it? Oh, nonsense, Sam, said Aunt Lois. I don't believe there's a word of truth in any of it. You can hatch more stories in one day than a hen can eggs in a month. Well, anyway, said Sam, I like the Episcopal service, all 'ceptin' the minister wearing his shirt outside. That I don't like. 'Tisn't a shirt, said Aunt Lois indignantly. Oh, Lord a massy, said Sam. I know what they calls it. I know it's a surplice, but it looks for all the world like a man in his shirt sleeves, but the words is real solemn. I wondered when he asked 'em all whether they had any objections to it, and told 'em to speak up if they had, what would happen if anybody should speak up just there. Why, of course it would stop the wedding, said Aunt Lois, until the thing was inquired into. Well, Jake Marshall, he said that he heard a story when he was a boy about a wedding in a church at Portsmouth that was stopped just there, 'cause, you see, the man he had another wife living. He said 'twas old Colonel Penhallow. Mazin' rich the old colonel was, and these here rich old cocks sometimes does seem to strut round and cut up pretty much as if they hadn't heard of no God in their parts. The colonel, he got his wife shut up in a lunatic asylum, and then spread the word that she was dead, and courted a gal, and come just as near as that to marryin' of her. As near as what? Said Aunt Lois. Why, when they got to that there part of the service, there was his wife, good as new. She'd got out of the asylum, and stood up there afore 'em all. So you see that there does some good. I'd rather stay in an asylum all my life than go back to that man, said Aunt Lois. Well, you see, she didn't, said Sam. Her friends, they made him make a settlement on her, poor woman, and he cleared out to England. Good riddance to bad rubbish, said my grandmother. Well, how handsome that there gal is that Harry's going to marry, continued Sam. She didn't have on nothing but white muslin, and not a snip of a jewel, but she looked like a queen. Says I to Jake, says I, there goes the woman 'twill be Lady Percival one of these days over in England, and I bet you he'll find lots of family jewels for her over there. Miss Delilah, she said she didn't doubt there would be. I hope, said my grandmother, that she will have more enduring riches than that. It's a small matter about earthly jewels. "Lordy massy, yes, Miss Badger," said Sam. "Just so, just so. Now that there was being impressed on my mind all the time. Folks oughtn't to lay up their treasures on airth. I couldn't help thinking on it, when I see Tiny wearing them jewels, just how vain and transitory everything is, and how the women's has wore 'em before is all turned to dust and lying in their graves. Lordy massy, these here things make us realize what a transitory world we's a-living in. I was telling Hepsy about it. She's so kind of worldly, Hepsy is. Seemed to make her feel so kind of gritty to see so much wealth and splendor when we hadn't none. Says I, Hepsy, there ain't no use of wanting worldly riches, 'cause our lives all passes away like a dream, and 100 years hence it won't make no sort of difference what we've had and what we haven't had. But, well, Miss Lois, did you see the carriage? Said Sam, returning to temporal things with renewed animation. I just got a glimpse of it, said Aunt Lois, as it drove to the door. Lordy massy, said Sam, I was all over that there carriage that morning by daylight. 'Tain't the one he had up here. That was just common doings. This year is imported spick and span new from England for the 'casion, and all made just as they make 'em for nobility. Why, 'twas all quilted and lined with blue satin, ever so grand, and turkey carpet under their feet, and the springs was easy as a rocking chair. That's what they've gone off in. Well, Lordy massy, I don't grudge Tina nothing. She's the chipperest, light-heartedest, darlingest little creature that ever did live, and I hope she'll have good luck in all things. A rap was heard at the kitchen door, and Polly entered. It was evident from her appearance that she was in a state of considerable agitation. She looked pale and excited, and her hands shook. Miss Badger, she said to my grandmother, Miss Rossiter wants to know if you won't come and set up with her tonight. Why, is she sick? Said grandmother. What's the matter with her? She ain't very well, said Polly evasively. She wanted Miss Badger to spend the night with her. Perhaps, mother, I'd better go over, said Aunt Lois. No, Miss Lois, said Polly eagerly. Miss Rossiter don't want to see anybody but your mother. Well, now, I want to know, said Sam Lawson. Well, you can't know everything, said Aunt Lois, so you may want. Tell Miss Rossiter if I can do anything for her, I hope she'll call on me, said Sam. My grandmother and Polly went out together. Aunt Lois bustled about the hearth, swept it up, and then looked out into the darkness after them. What could it be? The old clock ticked drowsily in the kitchen corner, and her knitting needles rattled. What do you think it is? Said my mother timidly to Aunt Lois. How should I know? Said Aunt Lois sharply. In a few moments Polly returned again. Miss Mehitable says she would like to see Sam Lawson. Oh, well, well, would she? Well, I'll come, said Sam, rising with joyful alertness. I'm allers ready at a minute's warning. And they went out into the darkness together. End of chapter 46.
Chapter 47 of Oldtown Folks. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Oldtown Folks by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Chapter 47. Behind the Curtain. In the creed of most storytellers, marriage is equal to translation. The mortal pair whose fortunes are traced to the foot of the altar forthwith ascend, and a cloud receives them out of our sight as the curtain falls. Faith supposes them rapt away to some unseen paradise, and everyday toil girds up its loins, and with a sigh prepares to return to its delving and grubbing. But our story must follow the fortunes of our heroine beyond the prescribed limits. It had been arranged that the wedding pair, after a sunny afternoon's drive through some of the most picturesque scenery in the neighborhood of Boston, should return at eventide to their country home, where they were to spend a short time preparatory to sailing for Europe. Even in those early days the rocky glories of Nahant and its dashing waves were known and resorted to by Bostonians, and the first part of the drive was thitherward, and Tina climbed around among the rocks, exulting like a sea-bird, with Ellery Davenport ever at her side, laughing, admiring, but holding back her bold, excited footsteps, lest she should plunge over by some unguarded movement, and become a vanished dream. So near lies the ever-possible tragedy at the hour of our greatest exultation. It is but a false step, an inadvertent movement, and all that was joy can become a cruel mockery. We all know this to be so. We sometimes start and shriek when we see it to be so in the case of others, but who is the less triumphant in his hour of possession for this gloomy shadow of possibility that forever dogs his steps? Ellery Davenport was now in the high tide of victory. The pursuit of the hour was a success. He had captured the butterfly. In his eagerness he had trodden down and disregarded many teachings and impulses of his better nature that should have made him hesitate. But now he felt that he had her. She was his alone, and forever. But already dark thoughts from the past were beginning to flutter out like ill-omened bats, and dip down on gloomy wing between him and the innocent, bright, confiding face. Tina, he could see, had idealized him entirely. She had invested him with all her conceptions of knighthood, honor, purity, religion, and made a creation of her own of him. And sometimes he smiled to himself, half amused and half annoyed at the very young and innocent simplicity of the matter. Nobody knew better than himself that what she dreamed he neither was nor meant to be, that in fact there could not be a bitterer satire on his real self than her conceptions, but just now, with her brilliant beauty, her piquant earnestness, her perfect freshness, there was an indescribable charm about her that bewitched him. Would it all pass away and get down to the jog-trot dustiness of ordinary married life, he wondered, and then ought he not to have been a little more fair with her in exchange for the perfect transparence with which she threw open the whole of her past life to him? Had he not played with her as some villain might with a little child, and got away a priceless diamond for a bit of painted glass? He did not allow himself to think in that direction. "Come, my little seagull," he said to her, after they had wandered and rambled over the rocks for a while. "You must come down from that perch, and we must drive on if we mean to be at home before midnight." "Oh, Ellery, how glorious it is!" "Yes, but we cannot build here 3 tabernacles, and so we must say au revoir. I will bring you here again." And Ellery half led, half carried her in his arms back to the carriage. "How beautiful it is," said Tina, as they were glancing along a turfy road through the woods. The white pines were just putting out their long fingers. The new leaves of the silvery birches were twinkling in the light. The road was fringed on both sides with great patches of the blue violet and sweet fern and bayberry, and growing green tips of young spruce and fir were exhaling a spicy perfume. "It seems as if we two alone were flying through fairyland." His arm was around her, tightening its clasp of possession, as he looked down on her. "Yes," he said, "we two are alone in our world now. None can enter it, none can see into it. None can come between us." Suddenly the words recalled to Tina her bad dream of the night before. She was on the point of speaking of it, but hesitated to introduce it. She felt a strange shyness in mentioning that subject. Ellery Davenport turned the conversation upon things in foreign lands, which he would soon show her. He pictured to her the Bay of Naples, the rocks of Sorrento, where the blue Mediterranean is overhung with groves of oranges, where they should have a villa some day and live in a dream of beauty. All things fair and bright and beautiful in foreign lands were evoked, and made to come as a sort of airy pageant around them while they wound through the still, spicy pine-woods. It was past sunset, and the moon was looking white and sober through the flush of the evening sky when they entered the grounds of their own future home. "How different everything looks here from what it did when I was here years ago," said Tina. "The paths are all cleared, and then it was one wild, dripping tangle. I remember how long we knocked at the door, and couldn't make anyone hear, and the old black knocker frightened me. It was a black serpent, with his tail in his mouth. I wonder if it is there yet." "Oh, to be sure it is," said Ellery. "That is quite a fine bit of old bronze, after something in Herculaneum, I think. You know, serpents were quite in vogue among the ancients." "I should think that symbol meant eternal evil," said Tina. "A circle is eternity, and a serpent is evil." "You are evidently prejudiced against serpents, my love," said Ellery. "The ancients thought better of them. They were emblems of wisdom, and the ladies very appropriately wore them for bracelets and necklaces." "I wouldn't have one for the world," said Tina. "I always hated them. They're so bright and still and sly." "Mere prejudice," said Ellery, laughing. "I must cure it by giving you one of these days an emerald green serpent for a bracelet, with ruby crest and diamond eyes. You've no idea what pretty fellows they are. But here, you see, we're coming to the house. You can smell the roses." "How lovely and how changed," said Tina. "Oh, what a world of white roses over that portico, roses everywhere, and white lilacs. It's a perfect paradise." "May you find it so, my little Eve," said Ellery Davenport as the carriage stopped at the door. Ellery sprang out lightly, and turning, took Tina in his arms and set her down in the porch. They stood there a moment in the moonlight and listened to the fainter patter of the horses' feet as they went down the drive. "Come in, my little wife," said Ellery, opening the door, "and may the black serpent bring you good luck." The house was brilliantly lighted by wax candles in massive silver candlesticks. "Oh, how strangely altered," said Tina, running about, and looking into the rooms with the delight of a child. "How beautiful everything is." The housekeeper, a respectable female, now appeared and offered her services to conduct her young mistress to her rooms. Ellery went with her, almost carrying her up the staircase on his arm. Above as below, all was light and bright. "This room is ours," said Ellery, drawing her into that chamber which Tina remembered years before as so weirdly desolate. Now it was all radiant with hangings and furniture of blue and silver. The open windows let in branches of climbing white roses, and vases were full of lilies. The housekeeper paused a moment at the door. "There is a lady in the little parlour below that has been waiting more than an hour to see you and madam," said she. "A lady?" said both Tina and Ellery, in tones of surprise. "Did she give her name?" said Ellery. "She gave no name, but said that you, sir, would know her." "I can't imagine who it should be," said Ellery. "Perhaps, Tina, I had better go down and see while you are dressing," said Ellery. "Indeed, that would be a pretty way to do. No, sir, I allow no private interviews," said Tina with authority. "No, I am all ready and quite dressed enough to go down." "Well then, little positive," said Ellery, "be it as you will. Let's go together." "Well, I must confess," said Tina, "I didn't look for wedding callers out here tonight, but never mind. It's a nice little mystery to see what she wants." They went down the staircase together, passed across the hall, and entered the little boudoir, where Tina and Harriet spent their first night together. The door of the writing cabinet stood open, and a lady all in black, in a bonnet and cloak, stood in the doorway. As she came forward, Tina exclaimed, "Oh, Ellery, it is she, the lady in the closet," and sank down, pale and half fainting. Ellery Davenport turned pale too. His cheeks, his very lips were blanched like marble. He looked utterly thunderstruck and appalled. "Emily," he said. "Great God!" "Yes, Emily," she said, coming forward slowly and with dignity. "You did not expect to meet me here and now, Ellery Davenport." There was for a moment a silence that was perfectly awful. Tina looked on without power to speak, as in a dreadful dream. The ticking of the little French mantel clock seemed like a voice of doom to her. The lady walked close up to Ellery Davenport, drew forth a letter, and spoke in that fearfully calm way that comes from the very white heat of passion. "Ellery," she said, "here is your letter. You did not know me, you could not know me, if you thought after that letter I would accept anything from you. I live on your bounty. I would sooner work as a servant." "Ellery, Ellery," said Tina, springing up and clasping his arm. "Oh, tell me who she is. What is she to you? Is she... "Be quiet, my poor child," said the woman, turning to her with an air of authority. "I have no claims, I come to make none. Such as this man is, he is your husband, not mine. You believe in him, so did I. Love him, so did I. I gave up all for him, country, home, friends, name, reputation, for I thought him such a man that a woman might well sacrifice her whole life to him. He is the father of my child. But fear not. The world, of course, will approve him and condemn me. They will say he did well to give up his mistress and take a wife. It's the world's morality. What woman will think the less of him, or smile the less on him, when she hears it? What woman will not feel herself too good even to touch my hand?" "Emily," said Ellery Davenport bitterly, "if you thought I deserved this, you might at least have spared this poor child." "The truth is the best foundation in married life, Ellery," she said, "and the truth you have small faculty for speaking. I do her a favor in telling it. Let her start fair from the commencement, and then there will be no more to be told. Besides," she added, "I shall not trouble you long. There," she said, putting down a jewel case, "there are your gifts to me. There are your letters." Then she threw on the table a miniature set in diamonds. "There is your picture. And now God help me. Farewell." She turned and glided swiftly from the room. Readers who remember the former part of this narrative will see at once that it was, after all, Ellery Davenport with whom, years before, Emily Rossiter had fled to France. They had resided there, and subsequently in Switzerland, and she had devoted herself to him and to his interests with all the single-hearted fervour of a true wife. On her part, there was a full and conscientious belief that the choice of the individuals alone constituted a true marriage, and that the laws of human society upon this subject were an oppression which needed to be protested against. On his part, however, the affair was a simple gratification of passion, and the principles, such as they were used by him as he used all principles, simply as convenient machinery for carrying out his own purposes. Ellery Davenport spoke his own convictions when he said that there was no subject which had not its right and its wrong side, each of them capable of being unanswerably sustained. He had played with his own mind in this manner until he had entirely obliterated conscience. He could at any time dazzle and confound his own moral sense with his own reasonings, and it was sometimes amusing, but in the long run tedious and vexatious to him, to find that what he maintained merely for convenience and for theory should be regarded by Emily so seriously, and with such an earnest eye to logical consequences. In short, the two came in the course of their intimacy precisely to the spot to which many people come who are united by an indissoluble legal tie. Slowly, and through an experience of many incidents, they had come to perceive an entire and irrepressible conflict of natures between them. Notwithstanding that Emily had taken a course diametrically opposed to the principles of her country and her father's, she retained largely the Puritan nature. Instances have often been seen in New England of men and women who had renounced every particle of the Puritan theology, and yet retained in their fibre and composition all the moral traits of the Puritans, their uncompromising conscientiousness, their inflexible truthfulness, and their severe logic in following the convictions of their understandings. And the fact was that while Emily had sacrificed for Ellery Davenport her position in society, while she had exposed herself to the very coarsest misconstructions of the commonest minds, and made herself liable to be ranked by her friends in New England among abandoned outcasts, she was really a woman standing on too high a moral plane for Ellery Davenport to consort with her in comfort. He was ambitious, intriguing, unscrupulous, and it was an annoyance to him to be obliged to give an account of himself to her. He was tired of playing the moral hero, the part that he assumed and acted with great success during the time of their early attachment. It annoyed him to be held to any consistency in principles. The very devotion to him which he felt, regarding him as she always did in his higher and nobler nature, vexed and annoyed him. Of late years he had taken long vacations from her society, in excursions to England and America. When the prospect of being ambassador to England dawned upon him, he began seriously to consider the inconvenience of being connected with a woman unpresentable in society. He dared not risk introducing her into those high circles as his wife. Moreover, he knew that it was a falsehood to which he never should gain her consent, and running along in the line of his thoughts came his recollections of Tina. When he returned to America with the fact in his mind that she should be the acknowledged daughter of a respectable old English family, all her charms and fascinations had a double power over him. He delivered himself up to them without scruple. He wrote immediately to a confidential friend in Switzerland, enclosing money, with authority to settle upon Emily a villa near Geneva and a suitable income. He trusted to her pride for the rest. Never had the thought come into his head that she would return to her native country and brave all the reproach and humiliation.
Chapter 48 of Oldtown Folks. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Oldtown Folks by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Chapter 48. Tina's Solution. Harry and I had gone back to our college room after the wedding. There we received an earnest letter from Miss Mehitable begging us to come to her at once. It was brought by Sam Lawson, who told us that he had got up at 3 o'clock in the morning to start away with it. "There's trouble of some sort or other in that there house," said Sam. "Last night I was in to the deacon's, and we was a-talking over the wedding, when Polly come in all sort of flustered, and said Miss Rossiter wanted to see Miss Badger, and your granny she went over and didn't come home all night. She sot up with somebody, and I'm sartain it 'twarn't Miss Rossiter, 'cause I see her up tolerable spry in the morning, but Lordy massy, something or other's been a-using on her up, for she was all wore out, and looked sort of limpsy, as if they weren't no starch left in her. She sent for me last night. 'Sam,' says she, 'I want to send a note to the boys just as quick as I can, and I don't want to wait for the mail. Can't you carry it?' 'Lordy massy, yes,' says I. 'I hope there ain't nothing happened,' says I, and you see she didn't answer me. And putting that with Miss Badger setting there all night, it appeared to me there was something. I can't make out quite what." Harry and I lost no time in going to the stage-house, and found ourselves by noon at Miss Mehitable's door. When we went in, we found Miss Mehitable seated in close counsel with Mr. Jonathan Rossiter. His face looked sharp and grave and hard. His large gray eyes had in them a fiery, excited gleam. Spread out on the table before them were files of letters, in the handwriting of which I had before had a glimpse. The brother and sister had evidently been engaged in reading them, as some of them lay open under their hands. When we came into the room, both looked up. Miss Mehitable rose and offered her hands to us in an eager, excited way, as if she were asking something of us. The color flashed into Mr. Rossiter's cheeks, and he suddenly leaned forward over the papers and covered his face with his hands. It was a gesture of shame and humiliation infinitely touching to me. "Horace," said Miss Mehitable, "the thing we feared has come upon us. Oh, Horace, Horace, why could we not have known in time?" I divined at once. My memory, like an electric chain, flashed back over sayings and incidents of years. "The villain," I said. Mr. Rossiter ground his foot on the floor with a hard, impatient movement, as if he were crushing some poisonous reptile. "It's well for him that I'm not God," he said through his closed teeth. Harry looked from one to the other of us in dazed and inquiring surprise. He had known in a vague way of Emily's disappearance and of Miss Mehitable's anxieties, but it never had occurred to his mind to connect the two. In fact, our whole education had been in such a wholesome and innocent state of society that neither of us had the foundation in our experience or habits of thought for the conception of anything like villainy. We were far enough from any comprehension of the melodramatic possibilities suggested in our days by that heaving and tumbling modern literature whose waters cast up mire and dirt. Never shall I forget the shocked, incredulous expression on Harry's face as he listened to my explanations, nor the indignation to which it gave place. "I would sooner have seen Tina in her grave than married to such a man," he said huskily. "Oh, Harry!" said Miss Mehitable. "I would," he said, rising excitedly. "There are things that men can do that still leave hope for them, but a thing like this is final. It is decisive." "That is my opinion, Harry," said Mr. Rossiter. "It is a sin that leaves no place for repentance." "We have been reading these letters," said Miss Mehitable. "They were sent to us by Tina, and they do but confirm what I always said, that Emily fell by her higher nature. She learned, under Dr. Stern, to think and to reason boldly, even when differing from received opinion, and this hardihood of mind and opinion she soon turned upon the doctrines he taught. Then she abandoned the Bible, and felt herself free to construct her own system of morals. Then came an intimate friendship with a fascinating married man, whose domestic misfortunes made a constant demand on her sympathy. And these charming French friends of hers, who were, as far as I can see, disciples of the new style of philosophy, and had come to America to live in a union with each other which was not recognized by the laws of France, all united to make her feel that she was acting heroically and virtuously in sacrificing her whole life to her lover, and disregarding what they called the tyranny of human law. In Emily's eyes, her connection had all the sacredness of marriage." "Yes," said Mr. Rossiter, "but see now how all these infernal, fine-spun, and high-flown notions always turn to the disadvantage of the weaker party. It is man who always takes advantage of woman in relations like these. It is she that gives all, and he that takes all. It is she risks everything, and he risks nothing. Hard as marriage bonds bear in individual cases, it is for women's interest that they should be stringently maintained as the Lord himself has left them. When once they begin to be lessened, it is always the weaker party that goes to the wall." "But," said I, "suppose a case of confirmed and hopeless insanity on either side?" He made an impatient gesture. "Did you ever think," he said, "if men had the laws of nature in their hands, what a mess they would make of them? what treatises we should have against the cruelty of fire in always burning, and of water in always drowning. What saints and innocents has the fire tortured, and what just men made perfect has water drowned, making no exceptions. But who doubts that this inflexibility in natural law is, after all, the best thing? The laws of morals are in our hands, and so reversible, and therefore we are always clamoring for exceptions. I think they should cut their way like those of nature, inflexibly and eternally. Here the sound of wheels startled us. I went to the window, and looking through the purple spikes of the tall old lilacs which came up in a bower around the open window, I saw Tina alighting from the carriage. "Oh, Auntie," I said involuntarily, "it is she. She is coming, poor child." We heard a light fluttering motion and a footfall on the stairs, and the door opened, and in a moment Tina stood among us. She was very pale, and there was an expression such as I never saw in her face before. There had been a shock which had driven her soul inward from the earthly upon the spiritual and the immortal. Something deep and pathetic spoke in her eyes as she looked around on each of us for a moment without speaking. As she met Miss Mehetabel's haggard, careworn face, her lip quivered. She ran to her, threw her arms around her, and hid her face on her shoulder, and sobbed out, "Oh, Auntie, Auntie, I didn't think I should live to make you this trouble." "You, darling," said Miss Mehetabel, "it is not you who have made it." "I am the cause," she said. "I know that he has done dreadfully wrong. I cannot defend him, but oh, I love him still. I cannot help loving him. It is my duty to," she added. "I promised, you know, before God. For better, for worse, and what I promised I must keep. I am his wife. There is no going back from that." "I know it, darling," said Miss Mehetabel, stroking her head. "You are right, and my love for you will never change." "I am come," she said, "to see what can be done." "Nothing can be done," spoke out the deep voice of Jonathan Rossiter. "She is lost, and we disgraced beyond remedy." "You must not say that," Tina said, raising her head, her eyes sparkling through her tears with some of her old vivacity. "Your sister is a noble, injured woman. We must shield her and save her. There is every excuse for her." "There is never any excuse for such conduct," said Mr. Rossiter harshly. Tina started up in her headlong, energetic fashion. "What right have you to talk so, if you call yourself a Christian?" she said. "Think a minute. Who was it said, 'Neither do I condemn thee'? And whom did he say it to? Christ was not afraid or ashamed to say that to a poor, friendless woman, though he knew his words would never pass away." "God bless you, darling, God bless you," said Miss Mehetabel, clasping her in her arms. "I have read those letters," continued Tina impetuously. "He did not like me to do it, but I claimed it as my right, and I would do it, and I can see in all a noble woman, gone astray from noble motives. I can see that she was grand and unselfish in her love, that she was perfectly self-sacrificing. And I believe it was because Jesus understood these things in the hearts of women that he uttered those blessed words. The law was against that poor woman. The doctors, the scribes, and Pharisees, all respectable people, were against her, and Christ stepped between all and her. He sent them away abashed and humbled, and spoke those lovely words to her. Oh, I shall forever adore him for it. He is my Lord and my God." There was a pause for a few moments, and then Tina spoke again. "Now, dear Auntie, hear my plan. You perhaps do not believe any good of him, and so I will not try to make you. Only I will say that he is anxious to do all he can. He has left everything in my hands. This must go no farther than us few who now know it. Your sister refused the property he tried to settle on her. It was noble to do it. I should have felt just as she did. But, dear Auntie, my fortune I always meant to settle on you, and it will be enough for you both. It will make you easy as to money, and you can live together." "Yes, my dear," said Miss Mehitable, "but how can this be kept secret when there is a child?" "I have thought of that, auntie. I will take the poor little one abroad with me. Children always love me. I can make her so happy, and oh, it will be such a motive to make amends to her for all this wrong. Let me see your sister, auntie, and tell her about it." "Dear child," said Miss Mehitable, "you can do nothing with her. All last night I thought she was dying. Since then she seems to have recovered her strength, but she neither speaks nor moves. She lies with her eyes open, but notices nothing you say to her." "Poor darling," said Tina. "But, auntie, let me go to her. I am so sure that God will help me, that God sends me to her. I must see her." Tina's strong impulses seemed to carry us all with her. Miss Mehitable arose, and, taking her by the hand, opened the door of the chamber on the opposite side of the hall. I looked in, and we saw that it was darkened. Tina went boldly in and closed the door. We all sat silent together. We heard her voice, at times soft and pleading. Then it seemed to grow more urgent and impetuous as she spoke continually and in tones of piercing earnestness. After a while there were pauses of silence, and then a voice in reply. "There," said Miss Mehitable. "Emily has begun to answer her, thank God. Anything is better than this oppressive silence. It's frightful." And now the sound of earnest conversation was heard, waxing on both sides more and more ardent and passionate. Tina's voice sometimes could be distinguished in tones of the most pleading entreaty, sometimes it seemed almost like sobbing. After a while there came a great silence, broken by now and then an indistinct word, and then Tina came out, softly closing the door. Her cheeks were flushed, her hair partially dishevelled, but she smiled brightly, one of her old triumphant smiles when she had carried a point. "I've conquered at last. I've won," she said, almost breathless. "Oh, I prayed so that I might, and I did. She gives all up to me. She loves me. We love each other dearly. And now I'm going to take the little one with me, and by I will bring her back to her, and I will make her so happy. You must give me the little darling at once, and I will take her away with us, for we are going to sail next week." "We sail sooner than I thought," she said, "but this makes it best to go at once." Miss Mehitable rose and went out, but soon reappeared, leading in a lovely little girl with great, round, violet-blue eyes and curls of golden hair. The likeness of Ellery Davenport was plainly impressed on her infant features. Tina ran towards her and stretched out her arms. "Darling," she said, "come with me." The little one, after a moment's survey, followed that law of attraction which always drew children to Tina. She came up confidently and nestled her head on her shoulder. Tina gave her her watch to play with, and the child shook it about, well pleased. "Emily want to go ride?" said Tina, carrying her to the window and showing her the horses. The child laughed and stretched out her hand. "Bring me her things, auntie," she said. "Let there not be a moment for a change of mind. I take her with me this moment." A few moments after, Tina went lightly tripping down the stairs, and Harry and I with her, carrying the child and its little basket of clothing. "There, put them in," she said. "And now, boys," she said, turning and offering both her hands, "good-bye. I love you both dearly, and always shall." She kissed us both, and was gone from our eyes before I awoke from the dream into which she had thrown me. "Well," said Miss Mehitable, when the sound of the wheels died away, "could I have believed that anything could have made my heart so much lighter as this visit?" "She was inspired," said Mr. Rossiter. "Tina's great characteristic," said I. "What makes her differ from others is this capacity of inspiration. She seems sometimes to rise in a moment to a level above her ordinary self, and to carry all up with her." "And to think that such a woman has thrown herself away on such a man," said Harry. "I foresee a dangerous future for her," said Mr. Rossiter. "With her brilliancy, her power of attraction, with the temptations of a new and fascinating social life before her, and with only that worthless fellow for a guide, I am afraid she will not continue our Tina." "Suppose we trust in him who guided her hitherto," said Harry. "People usually consider that sort of trust a desperate resort," said Mr. Rossiter. "May the Lord help her means it's all up with her." "We see," said I, "that the greatest possible mortification and sorrow that could meet a young wife Chapter 49 of Oldtown Folks. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Oldtown Folks by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Chapter 49. What Came of It? The next week Mr. and Mrs. Ellery Davenport sailed for England. I am warned by the increased quantity of manuscript which lies before me that if I go on recounting scenes and incidents with equal minuteness, my story will transcend the limits of modern patience. Richardson might be allowed to trail off into 7 volumes, and to trace all the histories of all his characters, even unto the 3rd and 4th generations. But Richardson did not live in the days of railroad and steam, and mankind then had more leisure than now. I am warned, too, that the departure of the principal character from the scene is a signal for general weariness through the audience, for looking up of gloves and putting on of shawls, and getting ready to call one's carriage. In fact, when Harry and I had been down to see Tina off, and had stood on the shore, watching and waving our handkerchiefs until the ship became a speck in the blue airy distance, I turned back to the world with very much the feeling that there was nothing left in it. What I had always dreamed of, hoped for, planned for, and made the object of all my endeavors, so far as this world was concerned, was gone. Gone, so far as I could see, hopelessly and irredeemably. And there came over me that utter languor and want of interest in every mortal thing, which is one of the worst diseases of the mind. But I knew that it would never do to give way to this lethargy. I needed an alterative, and so I set myself with all my might and soul into learning a new language. There was an old German immigrant in Cambridge with whom I became a pupil, and I plunged into German as into a new existence. I recommend everybody who wishes to try the waters of Lethe to study a new language and to learn to think in new forms. It is like going out of one sphere of existence into another. Some may wonder that I do not recommend devotion for this grand alterative, but it is a fact that when one has to combat with the terrible lassitude produced by the sudden withdrawal of an absorbing object of affection, devotional exercises sometimes hinder more than they help. There is much in devotional religion of the same strain of softness and fervor which is akin to earthly attachments, and the one is almost sure to recall the other. What the soul wants is to be distracted for a while, to be taken out of its old grooves of thought, and to run upon entirely new ones. Religion must be sought in these moods, in its active and perceptive form, what we may call its business character, rather than in its sentimental and devotional one. It had been concluded among us all that it would be expedient for Miss Mehetabel to remove from Oldtown and take a residence in Boston. It was desirable, for restoring the health of Emily, that she should have more change and variety, and less minute personal attention fixed upon her, than could be the case in the little village of Oldtown. Harry and I did a great deal of house-hunting for them, and at last succeeded in securing a neat little cottage on an eminence overlooking the harbor in the outskirts of Boston. Preparing this house for them and helping to establish them in it furnished employment for a good many of our leisure hours. In fact, we found that this home so near would be quite an accession to our pleasures. Miss Mehitable had always been one of that most pleasant and desirable kind of acquaintances that a young man can have, to wit, a cultivated, intelligent, literary female friend, competent to advise and guide one in one's scholarly career. We became greatly interested in the society of her sister. The strength and dignity of character shown by this unfortunate lady in recovering her position commanded our respect. She was never aware, and was never made aware by anything in our manner, that we were acquainted with her past history. The advice of Tina on this subject had been faithfully followed. No one in our circle or in Boston, except my grandmother, had any knowledge of how the case really stood. In fact, Miss Mehitable had always said that her sister had gone abroad to study in France, and her reappearance again was only noticed among the few that inquired into it at all as her return. Harry and I used to study French with her, both on our own account and as a means of giving her some kind of employment. On the whole, the fireside circle at the little cottage became a cheerful and pleasant retreat. Miss Mehitable had gained what she had for years been sighing for, the opportunity to devote herself wholly to this sister. She was a person with an enthusiastic power of affection, and the friendship that arose between the two was very beautiful. The experiences of the French Revolution, many of whose terrors she had witnessed, had had a powerful influence on the mind of Emily, in making her feel how mistaken had been those views of human progress which come from the mere unassisted reason when it rejects the guidance of revealed religion. She was in a mood to return to the faith of her fathers, receiving it again under milder and more liberal forms. I think the friendship of Harry was of great use to her in enabling her to attain to a settled religious faith. They were peculiarly congenial to each other, and his simplicity of religious trust was a constant corrective to the habits of thought formed by the sharp and pitiless logic of her early training. A residence in Boston was also favorable to Emily's recovery, and giving to her what no person who has passed through such experiences can afford to be without, an opportunity to help those poorer and more afflicted. Emily very naturally shrank from society. Except the Kitterys, I think, there was no family which she visited. I think she always had the feeling that she would not accept the acquaintance of any who would repudiate her were all the circumstances of her life known to them. But with the poor, the sick, and the afflicted, she felt herself at home. In their houses she was a sister of mercy, and a success of these sacred ministrations caused her, after a while, to be looked upon with a sort of reverence by all who knew her. Tina proved a lively and most indefatigable correspondent. Harry and I heard from her constantly, in minute descriptions of the great gay world of London society, into which she was thrown as wife of the American minister. Her letters were like her old self, full of genius, of wits, and of humour, sparkling with descriptions and anecdotes of character, and sometimes scrawled on the edges with vivid sketches of places or scenes or buildings that hit her fancy. She was improving, she told us, taking lessons in drawing and music, and Ellery was making a capital French scholar of her. We could see through all her letters an evident effort to set forth everything relating to him to the best advantage. Every good-natured or kindly action, and all the favorable things that were said of him, were put in the foreground, with even an anxious care. To Miss Mehitable and Emily came other letters, filled with the sayings and doings of the little Emily, recording minutely all the particulars of her growth and the incidents of the nursery, and showing that Tina, with all her going out, found time strictly to fulfill her promises in relation to her. "I have got the very best kind of maid for her," she wrote, "just as good and true as Polly is, only she is formed by the church catechism instead of the Cambridge platform. But she is faithfulness itself, and Emily loves her dearly." In this record also minute notice was taken of all the presents made to the child by the father, of all his smiles and caressing words. Without ever saying a word formally in her husband's defense, Tina thus contrived, through all her letters, to produce the most favorable impression of him. He was evidently, according to her showing, proud of her beauty and her talents, and proud of the admiration which she excited in society. For a year or two there seemed to be a real vein of happiness running through all these letters of Tina's. I spoke to Harry about it one day. "Tina," said I, "has just that fortunate kind of constitution, buoyant as cork, that will rise to the top of the stormiest waters." "Yes," said Harry, "with some women it would have been an entire impossibility to live happily with a man after such a disclosure. With Esther, for example. I have never told Esther a word about it, but I know that it would give her a horror of the man that she never could recover from." "It is not," said I, "that Tina has not strong moral perceptions, but she has this buoyant hopefulness. She believes in herself, and she believes in others. She always feels adequate to manage the most difficult circumstances. I could not help smiling that dreadful day when she came over and found us all so distressed and discouraged, to see what a perfect confidence she had in herself and in her own power to arrange the affair, to make Emily consent, to make the child love her, in short, to carry out everything according to her own sweet will, just as she has always done with us all ever since we knew her." "I always wondered," said Harry, "that with all her pride and all her anger Emily did consent to let the child go." "Why," said I, "she was languid and weak, and she was overborne by simple force of will. Tina was so positive and determined, so perfectly assured, and so warming and melting, that she carried all before her. There wasn't even the physical power to resist her." "And do you think," said Harry, "that she will hold her power over a man like Ellery Davenport?" "Longer, perhaps, than any other kind of woman," said I, "because she has such an infinite variety about her. But after all, you remember what Miss Debbie said about him, that he never cared long for anything that he was sure of. Restlessness and pursuit are his nature, and therefore the time may come when she will share the fate of other idols." "I regard it," said Harry, "as the most dreadful trial to a woman's character that can possibly be, to love, as Tina loves, a man whose moral standard is so far below hers. It is bad enough to be obliged to talk down always to those who are below us in intellect and comprehension, but to be obliged to live down all the while to a man without conscience or moral sense is worse. I think often, what communion hath light with darkness? And the only hope I can have is that she will fully find him out at last." "And that," said I, "is a hope full of pain to her, but it seems to me likely to be realized. A man who has acted as he has done to one woman certainly never will be true to another." Harry and I were now thrown more and more exclusively upon each other for society. He had received his accession of fortune with as little exterior change as possible. Many in his situation would have rushed immediately over to England, and taken delight in coming openly into possession of the estate. Harry's fastidious reticence, however, hung about him even in this. It annoyed him to be an object of attention and gossip, and he felt no inclination to go alone into what seemed to him a strange country, into the midst of social manners and customs entirely different from those among which he had been brought up. He preferred to remain and pursue his course quietly, as he had begun, in the college with me, and he had taken no steps in relation to the property except to consult a lawyer in Boston. Immediately on leaving college it was his design to be married, and to go with Esther to see what could be done in England, but I think his heart was set upon a home in America. The freedom and simplicity of life in this country were peculiarly suited to his character, and he felt a real vocation for the sacred ministry, not in the slightest degree lessened by the good fortune which had rendered him independent of it. 2 years of our college life passed away pleasantly enough in hard study, interspersed with social relaxation among the few friends nearest to us. Immediately after our graduation came Harry's marriage, a peaceful little idyllic performance which took us back to the mountains and to all the traditions of our old innocent woodland life there. After a wholesome fashion of New England clergymen, Mr. Avery had found a new mistress for his parsonage, so that Esther felt the more resigned to leaving him. When I had seen them off, however, I felt really quite alone in the world. The silent, receptive, sympathetic friend and brother of my youth was gone. But immediately came the effort to establish myself in Boston, and through the friendly offices of the Kitterys I was placed in connection with some very influential lawyers who gave me that helping hand which takes a young man up the first steps of the profession. Harry had been most generous and liberal in regard to all our family, and insisted upon it that I should share his improved fortunes. There are friends so near to us that we can take from them as from ourselves, and Harry always insisted that he could in no way so repay the kindness and care that had watched over his early years as by this assistance to me. I received constant letters from him, and from their drift it became increasingly evident that the claims of duty upon him would lead him to make England his future home. In one of these he said, quote, "I have always, as you know, looked forward to the ministry, and to such a kind of ministry as you have in America, where a man, for the most part, speaks to cultivated, instructed people living in a healthy state of society, where a competence is the rule, and where there is a practical equality. I had no conception of life, such as I see it to be here, where there are whole races who appear born to poverty and subjection, where there are woes and dangers and miseries pressing on whole classes of men, which no one individual can do much to avert or alleviate. But it is to this very state of society that I feel a call to minister. I shall take orders in the Church of England, and endeavor to carry out among the poor and the suffering that simple gospel which my mother taught me, and which, after all these years of experience, after all these theological discussions to which I have listened, remains in its perfect simplicity in my mind, namely, that every human soul on this earth has one friend, and that friend is Jesus Christ, its Lord and Savior. There is a redeeming power in being beloved, but there are many human beings who have never known what it is to be loved. And my theology is, once penetrate any human soul with the full belief that God loves him, and you save him. Such is to be my life's object and end, and in this ministry Esther will go with me hand in hand. Her noble beauty and gracious manners make her the darling of all our people, and she is above measure happy in the power of doing good which is thus put into her hands. As to England, mortal heart cannot conceive more beauty than there is here. It is lovely beyond all poets' dreams. Near to our place are some charming old ruins, and I cannot tell you the delightful hours that Esther and I have spent there. Truly, the lines have fallen to us in pleasant places. I have not yet seen Tina. She is abroad, traveling on the continent. She writes to us often, but, Horace, her letters begin to have the undertone of pain in them. Her skies are certainly beginning to fade. From some sources upon which I place reliance, I hear Ellery Davenport spoken of as a daring, plausible, but unscrupulous man. He is an integrant in politics, and has no domestic life in him, while Tina, however much she loves and appreciates admiration, has a perfect woman's heart. Admiration without love would never satisfy her. I can see, through all the excuses of her letters, that he is going very much one way and she another, that he has his engagements and she hers, and that they see really very little of each other, and that all this makes her sad and unhappy. The fact is, I suppose, he has played with his butterfly until there is no more down on its wings, and he is on the chase after new ones. So is my reading of poor Tina's lot. When I took this letter to Miss Mehetabel, she told me that a similar impression had long since been produced on her mind by passages which she had read in hers. Tina often spoke of the little girl as very lovely and as her greatest earthly comfort. A little one of her own, born in England, had died early, and her affections seemed thus to concentrate more entirely upon the child of her adoption. She described her with enthusiasm as a child of rare beauty and talent, with capabilities of enthusiastic affection. "Let us hope," said I, "that she does take her heart from her mother. Ellery Davenport is just one of those men that women are always wrecking themselves on. Men that have strong capabilities of passion and very little capability of affection. Men that have no end of sentiment and scarcely the beginning of real being. They make bewitching lovers, but terrible husbands." One of the greatest solaces of my life during this period was my friendship with dear old Madame Kittery. Ever since the time when I had first opened to her my boyish heart, she had seemed to regard me with an especial tenderness, and to connect me in some manner with the image of her lost son. The assistance that she gave me in my educational career was viewed by her as a species of adoption. Her eye always brightened, and a lovely smile broke out upon her face when I came to pass an hour with her. Time had treated her kindly. She still retained the gentle shrewdness, the love of literature, and the warm kindness which had been always charms in her. Some of my happiest hours were passed in reading to her. Chapter after chapter in her well-worn Bible needed no better commentary than the sweet brightness of her dear old face and her occasional reverent responses. Many Sabbaths, when her increasing infirmities detained her from church, I spent in a tender, holy rest by her side. Then I would read from her prayer-book the morning service, not omitting the prayer that she loved for the king and the royal family, and then, sitting hand in hand, we talked together of sacred things, and I often wondered to see what strength and discrimination there were in the wisdom of love, and how unerring were the decisions that she often made in practical questions. In fact, I felt myself drawn to Madame Kittery by a closer, tenderer tie than even to my own grandmother. I had my secret remorse for this, and tried to quiet myself by saying that it was because, living in Boston, I saw Madame Kittery oftener. But, after all, is it not true that as we grow older the relationship of souls will make itself felt? I revered and loved my grandmother, but I never idealized her. But my attachment to Madame Kittery was a species of poetic devotion. There was a slight flavor of romance in it, such as comes with the attachments of our maturer life oftener than with those of our childhood. Miss Debbie looked on me with eyes of favor. In her own way she really was quite as much my friend as her mother. She fell into the habit of consulting me upon her business affairs, and asking my advice in a general way about the arrangements of life. "I don't see," I said to Madame Kittery one day, "why Miss Deborah always asks my advice. She never takes it." "My dear," said she, with a quiet smile with which she often looked on her daughter's proceedings, "Debbie wants somebody to ask advice of. When she gets it, she is settled at once as to what she don't want to do. That's something." Miss Debbie once came to me with a face of great perplexity. "I don't know what to do, Horace. Our Thomas is a very valuable man, and has always been in the family. I don't know anything how we should get along without him, but he is getting into bad ways." "Ah," said I, "what?" "Well, you see it all comes of this modern talk about the rights of the people. I've instructed Thomas as faithfully as ever a woman could, but, do you believe me, he goes to the primary meetings. I have positive, reliable information that he does." "My dear Miss Kittery, I suppose it's his right as a citizen." "Oh, fiddlesticks and humbug," said Miss Debbie, "and it may be my right to turn him out of my service." "And would not that, after all, be more harm to you than to him?" suggested I. Miss Debbie swept up the hearth briskly, tapped on her snuff-box, and finally said she had forgotten her handkerchief and left the room. Old Madam Kittery laughed a quiet laugh. "Poor Debbie," she said. "She'll have to come to it. The world will go on." Thomas kept his situation for some years longer, till, having bought a snug place and made some favorable investments, he at last announced to Miss Debbie that, having been appointed constable with a commission from the governor, Chapter 50 of Oldtown Folks. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Oldtown Folks by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Chapter 50, The Last Chapter. It was 8 years after Tina left us on the wharf in Boston when I met her again. Ellery Davenport had returned to this country and taken a house in Boston. I was then a lawyer established there in successful business. Ellery Davenport met me with open-handed cordiality, and Tina with warm sisterly affection, and their house became one of my most frequent visiting places. Knowing Tina by a species of divination, as I always had, it was easy for me to see through all those sacred little hypocrisies by which good women instinctively plead and intercede for husbands whom they themselves have found out. Michelet says somewhere that, quote, "In marriage the maternal feeling becomes always the strongest in woman, and in time it is the motherly feeling with which she regards her husband." End quote. She cares for him, watches over him, with the indefatigable tenderness which a mother gives to a son. It was easy to see that Tina's affection for her husband was no longer a blind, triumphant adoration for an idealized hero, nor the confiding dependence of a happy wife, but the careworn anxiety of one who constantly seeks to guide and to restrain. And I was not long in seeing the cause of this anxiety. Ellery Davenport was smitten with that direst curse which, like the madness inflicted on the heroes of some of the Greek tragedies, might seem to be the vengeance of some incensed divinity. He was going down that dark and slippery road up which so few return. We were all fully aware that at many times our Tina had all the ghastly horrors of dealing with a madman, even when he was himself again, and sought, by vows, promises, and elusive good resolutions, to efface the memory of the past and give security for the future. There was no rest for Tina. In her dear eyes I could read always that sense of overhanging dread, that helpless watchfulness which one may see in the eyes of so many poor women in our modern life, whose days are haunted by a fear they dare not express, and who must smile and look gay and seem confiding when their very souls are failing them for fear. Still, these seasons of madness did not seem for a while to impair the vigor of Ellery Davenport's mind, nor the feverish intensity of his ambition. He was absorbed in political life in a wild, daring, unprincipled way, and made frequent occasions to leave Tina alone in Boston while he traveled around the country pursuing his intrigues. In one of these absences it was his fate at last to fall, in a political duel. 10 years after the gay and brilliant scene in Christchurch, some of those who were present as wedding guests were again convened to tender the last offices to the brilliant and popular Ellery Davenport. Among the mourners at the grave, 2 women who had loved him truly stood arm in arm. After his death, it seemed, by the general consent of all, the kindest thing that could be done for him, to suffer the veil of silence to fall over his memory. 2 years after that, one calm, lovely October morning, a quiet circle of friends stood around the altar of the old church when Tina and I were married. Our wedding journey was a visit to Harry and Esther in England. Since then, the years have come and gone softly. Ellery Davenport now seems to us as a distant dream of another life, recalled chiefly by the beauty of his daughter, whose growing loveliness is the principal ornament of our home. Miss Mehetabel and Emily form one circle with us, nor does the youthful Emily know why she is so very dear to the saintly woman whose prayers and teachings are such a benediction in our family. Not long since we spent a summer vacation at Oldtown to explore once more the old scenes, and to show to young Master Harry and Miss Tina the places that their parents had told them of. Many changes have taken place in the old homestead. The serene old head of my grandfather has been laid beneath the green sod of the burying ground, and my mother, shortly after, was laid by him. Old Parson Lothrop continued for some years, with his antique dress and his antique manners, respected in Oldtown as the shadowy minister of the past, while his colleague, Mr. Mordecai Rossiter, edified his congregation with the sharpest and most stringent New School Calvinism. To the last, Dr. Lothrop remained faithful to his Arminian views, and regarded the spread of the contrary doctrines, as a decaying old minister is apt to, as a personal reflection upon himself. In his last illness, which was very distressing, he was visited by a zealous Calvinistic brother from a neighboring town, who, on the strength of being a family connection, thought it his duty to go over and make one last effort to revive the orthodoxy of his venerable friend. Dr. Lothrop received him politely, and with his usual gentlemanly decorum remained for a long time in silence, listening to his somewhat protracted arguments and statements. As he gave no reply, his friend at last said to him, "Dr. Lothrop, perhaps you are weak, and this conversation disturbs you." "I should be weak indeed if I allowed such things as you have been saying to disturb me," replied the staunch old doctor. "He died like a philosopher, my dear," said Lady Lothrop to me, "just as he always lived." My grandmother, during the last part of her life, was totally blind. One would have thought that a person of her extreme activity would have been restless and wretched under this deprivation, but in her case blindness appeared to be indeed what Milton expressed it as being, "an overshadowing of the wings of the Almighty." Every earthly care was hushed, and her mind turned inward, in constant meditation upon those great religious truths which had fed her life for so many years. Aunt Lois we found really quite lovely. There is a class of women who are like winter apples. All their youth they are crabbed and hard, but at the further end of life they are full of softness and refreshment. The wrinkles had really almost smoothed themselves out in Aunt Lois's face, and our children found in her the most indulgent and painstaking of aunties, ready to run, to wait, to tend, and fetch and carry, and willing to put everything in the house at their disposal. In fact, the young gentleman and lady found the old homestead such very free and easy ground that they announced to us that they preferred altogether staying there to being in Boston, especially as they had the barn to romp in. One Saturday afternoon, Tina and I drove over Needmore with the view of having one more gossip with Sam Lawson. Hepsy, it appears, had departed this life, and Sam had gone over to live with a son of his in Needmore. We found him roosting placidly in the porch on the sunny side of the house. "Why, Lordy massy, bless your soul and body, if it ain't Horace Holyoke," he said when he recognized who I was. "Ain't this year your wife, is it? Well, well, how this year world does turn round. Well, now, who would have thought it? Here you be, and Tiny with you. Well, well." "Yes," said I, "here we are." "Well, now, just sit down," said Sam, motioning us to a seat in the porch. "I was just kind of reflectin' out here in the sun. Been a-readin' in the Missionary Herald they've been a-sendin' missionaries to Oswity, and they say there ain't going to be no winter there, and the bread just grows on the trees, so they don't have to make none, and there ain't no wood piles, nor splittin' wood, no nothing of that sort goin' on, and folks don't need no clothes to speak on. Now, I was just thinking that there's just the country to suit me. I wonder, now, if they couldn't find something for me to do out there. I could shoe the horses, if they had any. I could teach the natives their catechise, and kind of help round generally. These here winters get so cold here, I'm been a'most crooked up with the rheumatiz." "Why, Sam," said Tina, "where is Hepsy?" "Law, now, hain't you heard? Why, Hepsy, she's been dead, well, let me see, 'twas 3 years 14th of last May when Hepsy died. But she was clear worn out afore she died. Well, just half on her was clear paralyzed, poor critter, so she couldn't speak a word. That there was a great trial to her. I don't think she was resigned under it. Hepsy had an awful sight of grit. I used to talk to Hepsy, and talk, and try to set things afore her in the best way I could, so's to get her in a better state of mind. Do you believe, one day when I'd been a-talking to her, she kind of made a motion to me with her eye, and when I went up to her, what'd you think? Why, she just took and bit me, so did she." "Sam," said Tina, "I sympathize with Hepsy. I believe if I had been talked to an hour and couldn't answer, I should bite." Just so," said Sam. "I 'spect so. You see, women must talk. There's where 'tis. Well, now, don't you remember that Miss Mary Bell? She was of a good family in Boston. They used to board her out to Oldtown, 'cause she was crazy as a loon. They just let her go about 'cause she didn't hurt nobody. But, massy, her tongue used to run as if it was hung in the middle and run both ends. Yes, really couldn't hear yourself think when she was around. Well, she was visiting Parson Lothrop, and says he, 'Miss Bell, do pray see if you can't be still a minute.' 'Lord bless you, Dr. Lothrop, I can't stop talking,' says she. 'Well,' says he, 'you just take a mouthful of water and hold it in your mouth. Then maybe you can stop.' Well, she took the water, and she sot still a minute or two, and it kind of worked on her so, she jumped up and twitched off Dr. Lothrop's wig, and spun it right across the room into the fireplace. 'Bless me, Miss Bell,' says he, 'spit out your water and talk if you must.'" "I've often thought on it," said Sam. "I suppose Hepsy's felt a good deal so. Well, poor soul, she's gone to her rest. We're all on us a-goin', one arter another. Your gran'ther's gone, and your mother, and Parson Lothrop, he's gone, and Lady Lothrop, she's kind of solitary. I went over to see her last week, and says she to me, 'Sam, I don't know nothing what I shall do with my horses. I feed 'em well, and they ain't worked hardly any, and yet they act so, it's I'm almost afeard to drive out with 'em. I'm thinking it would be a good thing if she'd give up that there place of hern, and go live in Boston with her sister.'" "Well, Sam," said Tina, "what has become of old Crab Smith? Is he alive yet?" "Law, yes, he's creeping round here yet, but the old woman, she's dead," said Sam. "I tell you she's having her turn of hectoring him now, 'cause she keeps appearing to him, and scares the old critter most to death." "Appears to him?" said I. "Well, what do you mean, Sam?" "Well, just as true as you live and breathe, she does appear to him," said Sam. "Why, 'twas only last week my son Luke and we was settin' by the fire here, and I was a-holding a skein of yarn for Malviny to wind. Malviny, she's Luke's wife, when who should come in but old Crab, head first, looking so scart and white about the gills that Luke, says he, 'Why, Mr. Smith, what ails you?' says he. Well, the critter was so scared he couldn't speak. He just set down in the chair, and he shook so he shook the chair, and his teeth they chattered, and 'twas a long time 'fore they could get it out on him. But come to, he told us 'twas a bright moonlight night, and he was comin' along down the stone pasture, when all of a sudden he looks up, and there was his wife walkin' right alongside of him. He says he never seen nothing plainer in his life than he seed the old woman, just in her short gown and petticoat she allers wore, with her gold beads round her neck, and a cap on with a black ribbon round it, and there she kept a-walkin' right alongside of him, her elbow a-touchin' his'n, all along the road, and when he walked faster, she walked faster, and when he walked slower, she walked slower, and her eyes was sot and fixed on him, but she didn't speak no word, and he didn't darst to speak to her. Finally he says he gin a dreadful yell and run with all his might, and our house was the very first place he tumbled inter. Lordy massy, well, I couldn't help thinking it served him right. I told Saul about it last town meeting day, and Saul, I thought he'd a split his sides. Saul said he didn't know the old woman had so much spirit. Lordy massy, says he, if she don't do nothing more'n take a walk alongside him now and then, why, I say, let her rip. Serves him right. Well, said Tina, I'm glad to hear about old Saul. How is he? Old Saul? Well, he's doing first rate. He married Deacon Bijah Smith's daughter, and he got a good farm of his own, and boys bigger'n you be, considerable. Well, said Tina, how about Miss Asphyxia? Well, Saul told me she'd got a cancer or something or other the matter with her, but the old gal, she just sets her teeth hard and goes on a-working. She won't have no doctor nor nothing done for her, and I expect by-and-by she'll die a-standing up in the harness. Poor old creature! I wonder, Horace, if it would do any good for me to go see her. Has she a soul, I wonder, or is she nothing but a working machine? Well, I don't know, said Sam. This here world is curious, when we get to thinking about it. We think if we'd had the making on it, things would have been made some ways different from what they be. But then things is just as they is, and we can't help it. Sometimes I think, said Sam, embracing his knee profoundly. And then again, I don't know. There's all sorts of folks has to be in this here world, and I suppose the Lord knows what he wants 'em fer, but I'm sure I don't. I kind of hope the Lord'll fetch everybody out about right some of these here times. He ain't got nothing else to do. And it's his lookout and not ourn what comes of 'em all. But I should like to go to Ottawitty, and if you see any of these missionary folks, Horace, I wish you'd speak to 'em about it. End of chapter 50. End of Oldtown Folks by Harriet Beecher Stowe.